world changed quickly by the time the United States entered the Second World War. World War II presented a unique opportunity for women to contribute to the war effort. Women were no longer expected to stay at home and wait for men to return. They were encouraged to contribute to the war effort in whatever way they could. Women were encouraged to get out and support the war effort through propaganda. Posters, flyers, even Hollywood movies all contributed to the effort to get women involved. Mrs. Miniver, a 1942 film, was a good example of how the Office of War Information began to change the way women were portrayed in film. Previously, women were portrayed as damsels in distress and dependent on men. The OWI noticed that the public portrayal affected societal norms and began to sponsor films that showed women helping in hospitals, maintaining good spirits at the home and abroad, salvaging war material, and joining branches of the military. One way the women on the home front contributed to the war effort was by balancing the financial burdens of their households while men were away at war. Propaganda was created to encourage women to use rations in response to wartime shortages. Women were encouraged to create tasty and healthy meals lest they contribute to their family's malnutrition, aka the hidden hunger, causing war production to slow down and ultimately cause soldiers' demise. Even Betty Crocker saluted women's roles in wartime meal planning, recognizing the efforts and accomplishments of women today as boundless. Women on the home front also contributed to the war effort by raising war bonds. Stars would tour the country helping the war cause by raising bond sales. As one 1943 article in Modern Screen magazine noted, "Believe us, nobody has to ask what Hollywood is doing in this war." To date, its war bond sales amount to $838,250,000. Among the things that the sum can buy are 8 battleships for our sons or 24 cruisers for our brothers. Women's most significant contributions, however, came from them joining the workforce. All across the United States, women were called to work with propaganda slogans like "Do the job he left behind" and "Women in the war, we can't win without them." A 1943 Fortune magazine shared women were responding to the call to work by working as barbers, butchers, taxi drivers, slaughterhouse workers, railroad track tenders, firefighters. Although they were looked on as temporary labor pool and would return to their household duties after the war. Over 6 million women would join the workforce during this time, taking on positions only previously held by men. With the help of many women workers, the American war industry had produced 296,429 planes, over 102,351 tanks and guns, 87,620 warships, 47 tons of ammunition. These previously male-dominated jobs allowed women to take up jobs in factories, shipyards, and steel mills. One of the largest aircraft plants, Douglas Aircraft, employed 22,000 women during the war to build bombers and transport planes. One of these women, Lee Foreigner, stated, "Gee, that's great. They need me." Foreigner had initially joined because she was lonesome and really looked forward to being a vital part of the war effort. The efforts that women like Lee put forth helped build many of the bombers and transport planes used in Europe and the Pacific, supporting the Air Corps in World War II. Women also contributed to the war effort by building ships. Shipyards needed an additional 30,000 workers along the Gulf of Mexico. So in 1942, the Brooklyn Navy Yard lifted their 141-year ban on hiring women. One woman, Katie Grant, recounted, "I took classes on how to weld. I had leather gloves, leather pants, a big hood, goggles, and a leather jacket. They said you weld like you crochet. So I thought of this when they taught us how to hold a welding rod with one hand and the torch fire in the right hand." Although it was no picnic, women like Katie contributed to the building of almost 90,000 ships used to supply the Navy fleet during the war. Women also contributed to the war effort by producing ammunition, one of the most hazardous jobs. Susan B. Anthony II stated, "One of the biggest women-employing industries today is small arms ammunition. Women form almost half of all the workers trimming bullet jackets and assembling bullets and cartridges, as well as loading powder bags, assembling and loading shells and cartridges cases, primers, and detonators. But it's got to be done. America's women at the time of the war became the most viable manpower available and led courageously throughout the war." One way women helped contribute to the war effort was being part of the military and joining the fight, but the public was not happy with sending their women into combat and was protective of them. Nursing was the only job that women were allowed to do in the U.S. Army and Navy up until World War II. Women started performing non-combat military work so that men could be sent into battle. In May 1942, Congress passed the bill allowing women to serve as auxiliaries to the U.S. Army, and after Pearl Harbor, efforts sped up to include a women's corps. In February 1942, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall named Oveta Culp Hobby as the first director of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, known as WWII. Recruiting began right away, but not everyone was pleased, especially religious leaders. In February of 1943, the female Marines came into being. WWICs were deployed to three main parts of the Army Air Corps, as weather observers, forecasters, radio operators, repair women, control tower operators, and aerial photograph analysts. For the Army Service Forces, they served as cryptologists, photographers, telephone operators, mechanics, medical lab technicians, and other clerical jobs. For the Army Ground Forces, they mostly worked in secretarial jobs and motor pools. WWIC officers were sent overseas and hand-picked. They were highly qualified volunteers, and many were bilingual. Within weeks of D-Day in June 1944, WWICs were sent into France for the first time. The women worked to decode messages sent to and from U.S. and British units. Nurses helped contribute in the war effort by caring for the sick and injured during World War II. In 1901, the Army Nurse Corps was established, as well as the Navy Nurse Corps in 1908. They were the first group of women officially recognized as part of the military, but still only recognized as serving as civilians with no military ranking. Only 29 nurses were stationed at the Navy hospital at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese bombers attacked and worked tirelessly to attend the wounded. At the beginning of World War II, there were only a few thousand military nurses, but by the end of the war, there were 59,000 in the Army Nurse Corps and 11,000 in the Navy Nurse Corps. Military nurses endured much less stigma than other women's branches because they were closely related to ideas of feminine nurturing and support. Nurses came closer to battle. They were going into front lines, into foxholes, and in the course of the war, 16 died as a result of direct enemy fire. They were known as Angels of Mercy for their self-sacrificing and nurturing job. A large number of Army and Navy nurses went overseas. They trained male medical corpsmen to tend to troops in the areas that female nurses were not allowed to go to. Some nurses also became prisoners of war, and many discovered they had serious diseases after being rescued. Women also got involved in the war effort through volunteering. Women had many ways to volunteer. However, the Red Cross was a popular avenue. Red Cross volunteers put together food packages and sent them to American prisoners of war across the world. They also put together basic care packages called comfort kits and sent them to the troops as well. Women on the home front would also put on parties for the soldiers who were on rest and relaxation, which was a popular way for the military men to raise their spirits. The women would also help the wounded write home and send audio messages, which often took form of giving family members a warning about the trauma incurred from war. They would help the soldiers sew buttons and distribute entertainment on basis for morale. Apart from the Red Cross, women planted victory gardens and organized scrap metal drives. Community organizations were put together that helped with civil defense, patrolling the beaches and streets, and looking for enemy planes. Women were also encouraged to volunteer for military duty. It was important to know that they volunteered and were not drafted. As such, the volunteer units of women received nicknames. WAVES were the Navy volunteers, SPAR was the Coast Guard volunteers, WASP were the nickname given to the women who volunteered to help the Army Air Corps, and the Marines simply called their volunteers Marines. This was unique, but the Marine officers had a rationale for it. Commandant Thomas Holcomb was quoted in Life magazine explaining why they did not need a nickname in 1944. They don't have a nickname, and they don't need one. They get their basic training in a Marine atmosphere at a Marine post. They inherit the traditions of the Marines. They are Marines. African American women continued to face trials during World War II. They largely participated in the same war support efforts that white women did, including working in factories, building airplanes, and taking civilian jobs such as streetcar drivers. African American women also worked clerical jobs, mostly in the post office, treasury, and justice departments. The relative abundance of available jobs was due to the executive order by President Roosevelt in 1941, which banned shutting out workers from the defense program based on race, religion, color, and national origin. All citizens were then allowed to work in civilian defense. The amount of African American women who worked up north in the industrial sector rose from 6.5% of the total work population to 18% because of this. African American women volunteered in much the same way that white women did, although they had separate clubs. Their clubs included the Women's Army for National Defense, or WAND, as well as the American Women Volunteer Services, or AWVS. African American women worked however they could and saw it as their duty to help the war effort. They were cognizant of the fact that they and their husbands, brothers, and sons were seen as second-class citizens and saw the war effort as a way to continue to fight for equality. One way this was done was through entering into the Cadet Nurse Corps, which allowed African American women to the open door they needed to get into nursing during World War II. In World War II, women contributed to the war effort in many ways. Their bravery and sacrifice on the home front showed in the way they stepped up to the challenge of taking over the jobs left behind when their men went off to serve in the war, and actively working industrial or other paid jobs that men thought before the war that only they could do. Women served in the war in military roles and as military nurses, some working very close to the front lines. Women volunteered a great deal during World War II, and women of color, despite still being discriminated against, bravely contributed in the war effort. Women's contributions helped win the war, and it showed in their bravery, sacrifice, independence, and determination to their country.